Tragically, I lost my son, Ben, to a fentanyl overdose. It was the hardest thing I had ever had to endure. It's happening across Canada. Fentanyl is wiping out an entire generation of our people. So we started a foundation, Guardians of Recovery, to help people with mental health and addictions who are struggling and not included in society. We've done a great job of including people with disabilities in our society. Now imagine a world where people with mental health and addictions have that same level of inclusion. That's what we're about to do. We are inviting you to take part in one of the most progressive and creative initiatives of our time, building sober living homes for our people to make sure they are cared for and have an opportunity to completely come off substance and live normal, productive lives. Well, hello there, everyone. Welcome back to our Guardians of Recovery live stream podcast, where we confront the crisis of mental health and addictions in our country. We discuss issues like the flawed housing crisis and drug treatment downfalls. I'm your host, Tina Olivero. Today, we are absolutely honored to have a brilliant mind, Denise Boudreau, who is the founder of Breakpoint Communities for Public Safety, joining us today. Welcome, Denise.
Thanks, Tina. It's a pleasure to be here with you.
Yes, so it's so interesting to speak with you because you're the type of person who has your science, your facts and figures, your law information to kind of back up the things that you have to say. So it's a real pleasure to have that kind of intelligence on the show. But before we get into any of that, tell us about Breakpoint as a nonprofit organization and how you guys are supporting all of the mental health and addiction issues that we have with your data, your research, and your science.
Gladly. So we formed a collective network when myself and a few other key people with policy and political background, we realized the magnitude of the issue was on a national basis. And so we got out there and made the connections to get leaders together into sort of a collective think tank. And next thing you know, we were a coalition, and now we're a federally registered nonprofit organization. So collectively, we probably have more than 5 years of steady research. And it's not just me. You know, I have a group of people that I work with, some more closely than others, but we're almost 20 communities now and growing. And so what we are able to offer is a support system. So for our communities, we are able to get people up to speed with understanding how we got here and being able to strategize how to find our way out and create a social safety net around us as well, because this is really the pain point. You know, we've lost a social safety net within our communities. And so the whole idea is figuring out how we got here to get out.
Mm-hmm. So right now we are in the midst of an illicit drug crisis. We currently have 21 people per day across Canada overdosing. We also have another 23 people a day, overdosing and dying. We have another 23 people a day overdosing and, ending up in hospital. They get out, they could overdose again. But these are alarming figures. And on top of that drug crisis and the number of deaths, which is now mounting to, the same as COVID-19, it doesn't have the same infrastructure to support overcoming it like COVID-19 did, but it's definitely up there when it comes to the numbers of people who have died, the number of people are being impacted, and those numbers are skyrocketing and exponentially increasing year over year. Here in Newfoundland, it's unbelievable what's going on for such a small population. So how does your organization actually support, the people who are just devastated by this crisis?
Well, how we support our communities in dealing with the immediate and negative impact is we provide them with some information that will help them to do a local community impact assessment, because your decision makers aren't doing that for you. We feel that it should be something that they were doing, but public safety was not a priority. And when I say public safety, I don't just mean the surrounding residential community. I mean all citizens. There's so many aspects to public safety, and
Yeah.
that includes the service users too. But the community impact assessment will allow you to measure the increase in crime that's going to come into your area because of drug induced crime,
Mm-hmm.
and so being able to have that data will help you be able to go back to your decision makers. We also have some petitions. We have 2 federal petitions that are ongoing right now. One is with MP Cheryl Gallant. The other is with MP Kevin Vuong. They're both, one's a paper format and one is an e-petition. But what we're trying to advocate for is recovery programs. In our research, alarmingly, we found, and I don't think a lot of people realize how underfunded recovery programs are. I don't think people understand that it makes you look at people who are suffering with addiction in a little bit of a different way when you realize that recovery programs are not readily available, that there's actually a barrier to their recovery. And so the current system is keeping them stuck in their trauma, keeping them stuck in their addiction. We in the surrounding community get to witness that. And that's traumatic.
Yeah.
That's causing a lot of trauma and a lot of anxiety for the surrounding community. And it's, we're treated like villains. We're treated like that we're just, we don't like homeless people. And it's a really unfair perspective to take. It only really just shuts down a conversation. And the conversation that needs to be had is, why is this happening? Why are we witnessing this level of human suffering out on our streets, and to the degree and magnitude that it is visible?
Yeah.
And that's, we're helping people sort of process this and figure out a way out.
Mm-hmm. Well, first and foremost, a lot of people don't recognize or realize that, the brain illness of addiction is a brain illness. It's not a choice. So all these people are treating it like a choice, when usually there's a lot of underlying mental health issues going on that are left untreated. And, our society waits for people to hit rock bottom until they actually give them help, which is criminal in my mind, because you have a very vulnerable person who is suffering with a mental illness, who doesn't get help and often doesn't even know that they're sick. If they have anosognosia, they can't self-reflect. So these are very, very troubling times that we are allowing people who are super sick to live on their own in the elements, on the streets in tents. We wouldn't do that to people with dementia. Why would we do it with people with the brain illness addiction? It's absolutely ridiculous. And then for people to say care about people, that's absolutely wrong. That's the opposite of what we do. We care immensely. That's why we're having the conversation. So polarizing views is not helping the situation at all. What we want to do is have all roads lead to recovery. And if someone's not ready to recover, that's fine. But that doesn't mean create or architect a society that is built around perpetuating addiction as opposed to all roads leading to recovery. You're right. All of our funds, where are our funds going? Low barrier shelters. What's a low barrier shelter? A place where people can continue to use drugs, all under the auspices of human rights. It's their human right. And if anything else, we'd be taking away their human rights. So let's talk about human rights. Let's talk about whose rights are actually being infringed upon here.
Well, there's two factions of society that are at a disservice with this philosophy. Number one, people who suffer with addictions and serious mental health have disabilities, and those disabilities are not being accommodated. That's another legal term, accommodation. Accommodation is not happening in these low barrier shelters. And so you could say that it's the shelter occupants themselves that are being discriminated against or are not accommodated in these housing models.
Right.
They require something called intensive supportive housing. And that's not just supportive housing, that's intensive supportive housing. This requires medical staff. This is professionally trained supervision. It doesn't mean they have no freedom. What does it look like? Well, I'm not here to architect the solution. I didn't architect the problem, but I do know that if you want to talk about and they want to weaponize human rights, basically the shelter occupants, the service users themselves would have to advocate for their human rights. But I don't think they're of the sound mind to do that. Now, are they? So that's low hanging fruit. The other, probably the more.
Sorry to interrupt, but before you go on, that low hanging fruit, that is the actual access point, because isn't the onus on the people who are supplying drug den shelters and accommodations that are low barrier, isn't it the onus on them to prove that that person is not a danger to themselves and the people around them? Isn't it?
No, because it's an unregulated environment. It's not a hospital. It's not a health service. It's a housing service, and that's an unregulated environment, which is why combining a health service with a housing situation is it's not a regulated environment. And so what we're finding is no policy framework, no plan, no measurement for success, no long-term metrics for any success. And it's really just our measure of success is we provided a roof.
Right.
That's it.
Yeah, that is it. So underneath all of that, there's a huge fallout, obviously.
Well, and I did want to make sure I mentioned that I think the most obvious argument for human rights is one that's been drastically forgotten and missed, and that is the best interests of the children. And children have fundamental international human rights to be protected from abuse, harm, and obviously potentially fatal drugs, which we know are flying around like candy in these drug-induced environments. So, you know, if it's not the cost and if it's not the moral argument or the human rights or the social issues, I don't know what gives with this situation, because it's this is not a civil society when it's not righteous. You know, there's not a population that's given more equality but does harm to the community is not a righteous society. Not in my view.
No, not in my view either. Because if you give people that type of liberties without any personal responsibility, you have absolute bedlam and chaos. And that's what's happening across the country. And everybody's saying, well, the privacy laws, you can't infringe on people's privacy. It's a human rights issue. You can't infringe on people's human rights. Well, at what point, if you're dealing with someone who hasn't even been checked to see if they have a debilitating brain disorder that doesn't give them cause and effect, at what point can you stand for that argument?
I think all of these points need to be challenged. And so far, I only know of one small town in Coburg that is challenging the Human Rights Commission. And with details aside, it comes with a lot of backlash. It's definitely a news item. It's something that we're all watching closely, and we want to see the outcome. But I think if more municipalities that have resources, you can go into the coffers and get legal. You can get legal support for this.
Mhm.
If you can make these calculated decisions and challenge some of what's out there on the human rights side, we might come out with a different and more successful outcome for everybody. So, like, you got to be able to put some measures in place to protect your community, and especially the children. You have to protect the children. And if putting some sort of, bylaw in place that's meant to protect children in the event of certain things that might take place, or placing personal liability on the service providers,
Oh,
permits, exemptions, there's a lot of things you can do. Having the Human Rights Commission get involved doesn't necessarily mean that you can't enforce your bylaw. I just think it's a challenge that people are afraid to have, and activism gets in the way as well.
well, like in the case of my son, Ben, who passed away from fentanyl overdose, that was the end of the line. It began, though, with the fact that, we have so-called harm reduction models, and people going into schools and telling the kids, if you have any troubles at home, talking to teens now, if you have any troubles at home, you can get emancipated, you can go on social services, we'll take care of your housing and this and that. And what they didn't say was, you're going to go on the streets, you're going to be malnutritioned, you're going to starve, you're not going to make it, you're going to die in 7 years. You're going to witness murders, be raped, stolen from, you're going to live in drug den shelters, beaten the crap out of. And they forgot all that off the emancipation brochure. Meanwhile, parents are home with safe home with their kids, and their kids are being lured out into society under the auspices that they can smoke weed and get a free house to do it in, which is why we have an abundance of trap houses on every corner in this city.
Well,
how does that protect children?
I mean, the drug culture is a subculture. It's a subculture that is unique to its participants, but and the rest of the rest of society is conforming to what our norms are. But in that drug subculture, there's a whole bunch of things like what you just described, really bad and horrible things that cause lifelong trauma to especially young people, if they even survive it. So to cherry coat what's going on is the wrong thing to do. It is a moral disaster on the part of any of the decision makers that are sugarcoating any of this. They're promoting programs, but the devil is always in the details. And I find that's kind of a pattern. You make it sound good, and it's like the spin doctors, they make everything sound good. But if you actually did your research, or God forbid you had to live through it, would you even come out on the other side? And if you did, would you still be of sound mind? It's just that traumatic. Like, this whole drug subculture is not something that should ever be promoted. What's happening to these people's brains? Why do they do these horrific things to each other? Why do we have so many drug traffickers? And with this whole sort of drug infused nation that seems to be created, are we not creating a nation of drug trafficking? Like, what is the outcome here, folks, if it's not that?
People, like, what's on the go with Canada Post? Everyone I talk to since forming Guardians of Recovery, I get a lot of calls from people who want to recover. I ask them, where do you get your drugs? Oh, I get them in the mail. Oh, I just buy them down the street. Oh, I get my doctor to prescribe them. Oh, well, that's just, we started manufacturing fentanyl in BC. Like, these are things where obviously many, many people have to look away, get paid off, have to be bribed, have to, exacerbate or enable the situation. We don't have a drug crisis in Canada because people are, abiding by the laws. We have a drug crisis in Canada because quite the opposite. Drugs have been purposely have a narrative that drugs are acceptable, cocaine is cool, and that this is our new way of living. This, if you're not in the drug culture, then there's something wrong with you. Like, how did we get there, and how many people are looking the other way? Like, you can drive down the Merchant Road here and watch people shooting up right in front of you, and there'll be a cop car in eyesight, and they're sitting there, do nothing about it.
Well, a lot of these well-intentioned policies start off based on an emotion. We call it toxic compassion, where there doesn't seem to be any boundaries on how far they will allow this to impact the surrounding community or impact the users themselves as they become morbid, they become diseased, they become disabled, more and more disabled, especially their brains, as you know. How is this compassionate?
Yeah.
And we once had a Toronto police sergeant come to one of our meetings to tell us, if you wonder why do the police stand back, fail to act, or don't get involved? Some of it is to do with drug policy and what can and can't be done within an injection site or surrounding a drug use program. But a lot of it has to do with political will. Okay, so you have emotion, you have political will, you have well-intentioned programs that are they're unwilling to admit limitations, and they don't want to admit failure. That's for sure, and we're seeing that right now. I mean, David Eby, he couldn't have looked more depressed when he announced that he was going to do something good.
Yeah,
because he didn't really think he was doing something good. He's one of the people on the other side, but we have to take the emotion and the politics out of this and actually look from a panoramic view and see what is happening, what is the fallout, how is this affecting communities, children, and next generations of children, because the fallout is that the overdose is the number one cause of death in youth in BC right now.
across Canada.
As young as 10 years old. How do you think this is happening? It couldn't possibly be coincidental.
The number one cause of death in our youth across Canada, ages 10 to 19, is illicit drugs.
I don't think this is a coincidence. And so can we, basically our goal is, it's severalfold, but one of our goals is to get recovery programs back on the agenda. We need our healthcare system back intact. We want, and we have to have recovery programs, because it's not good enough just to say, well, people won't opt for recovery. Well, then should we just not try? Should we not try to do better then, because you don't think? No, that is wrong. There's lots of people that have recovered and come out, and if you don't give people hope, then you're giving them death.
Yeah, exactly.
This is the conversation.
Yeah, precisely. I couldn't agree more. These are comments coming through as you're talking. And here Charmaine says, I'm waiting for my son now for over 20 years to hit rock bottom. And it would be nice to get him checked for anosognosia, meaning he doesn't have the capacity to even see that he is sick. He doesn't have cause and effect. He's on drugs for over 20 years. Like, he's decimated. Somebody has to help him.
That's a failure to accommodate the disability by turning away and saying, as long as we provide as long as we provide a roof and some clean needles, everything's fine here. Nothing to see.
Yeah.
Well, that's not accommodating
No.
somebody who has a disability and is not of sound mind. And yes, we can intervene. We just
Mhm.
need the political will to do so.
Yeah. And that to me is where are his human rights for medical treatment? That's the breach in the human right.
Exactly. But, while they're busy weaponizing human rights to housing,
Yeah.
they not acknowledging that actually the people who are being discriminated against are those who are being denied treatment, actual treatment.
Bingo. That's it right there.
It's
That's
true.
the whole reason why we are where we are, because we have an enabling culture that
Nobody's
does not.
challenging that, and I think there's reasons why it's not being challenged is because it's a big fight. You've got activists, you've got politicians, you've got so many people on the other side of it that are paid to show up. That we've got big advocacy groups out there that are paid to show up, and what they're pushing, and it's not what we're pushing. Although it's hard to understand why anybody would disagree with, hey, let's get recovery programs going. Like, to stand in the way of that is not a good look.
No, that's for sure. And the fact that all this money is going to low barrier shelters and none of it is going to, or very little of it is going to recovery, like there's an awful lot of people who actually want to be in a sober recovery facility or a sober home.
Yeah, and we have a gentleman who volunteered to be on the community liaison committee in my region, and that's what they formed when they agreed on their low barrier shelter. Well, when they brought the low barrier shelter, they offered a community liaison committee, and he actually stood up in council one day and said, "You are continually victimizing the people who are addicted that are now front and center inside of a drug-induced environment where if somebody was recently recovered, they're going to relapse. If somebody wants to recover, they're not going to get there. They're constantly being preyed upon by traffickers. They're constantly being drawn back in, and they're constantly being manipulated and bullied and beaten and whatever it takes for them to be useful to those who are making a profit off of this subculture." And he's always saying it, and he did mention this, but at that point, when we're just having a community engagement, which is not a public consultation, it wasn't something. I think it was an impactful statement, but I don't think it was something they could have considered because the decision had already been made. And we all of our communities feel really sore about that fact that these decisions were made with no discussion. Some of these discussions have merit, like the one I just described, where somebody showed up and said, "How could you do this to people who truly are vulnerable because they may actually have a genuine need and want to get better and are just waiting for that hopeful event to happen." But how is that ever going to happen in these environments where they're constantly being preyed upon? And that is the truth.
Yeah. Well, it's so bad here in Newfoundland that they won't stay in the unsafe shelters. They'll stay in tents in the middle of February instead of being in drug den shelters because they know they could get stabbed. They know that people take advantage of them. They know they could get raped. In the case of my son, who had an underlying mental illness, bipolar, he was used at a very young age as a drug mule and kept him addicted, right? And used him as a drug mule. Like that whole system is child abuse. The whole thing is child abuse. When you're dealing with anyone who's 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, these are kids. They don't have the capacity, even if there's nothing wrong.
Yeah, well, no doubt that they are vulnerable, but I have to push back when they're referred to as the most vulnerable, because I really can't accept that when we know that our most vulnerable populations are our children.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. Oh, it's frustrating. That's for sure. And then the whole harm reduction model on top of all that, when it comes to people who then decide, okay, well, not only are we going to give you a house to live in, but we're going to provide you with the drugs to go with it and the alcohol in alcohol managed programs to go with it. But shouldn't the onus be on the people to prove that these substances are not doing further harm before they actually?
Should, yes. That's one of our arguments, is that housing is not a regulated environment, and yet these people have health concerns. They have serious mental illness, chronic addiction, most of them. That's why they're in a low barrier shelter. They might be coming out of incarceration. They might be coming out of a mental institution. They could be coming out from an encampment situation. So this is typical off the by names list. That's another detail that's never really offered up. But if you do your research, you know that a lot of these people have been released from custody. And a lot of, if you look at the point in time data on homelessness, you'll realize that a large, if not majority of people who are in a low barrier shelter will be people with addictions, and these are illnesses and disabilities, and yet here they are in a housing situation that's completely unregulated. There's no policy framework, no measurement for success, no, here's how many people got into recovery, here's how many people went into transitional housing, here's how many people went back onto the street, here's, like, what is your measurement for success? And furthermore, without this sort of regulation, we're only going to be experiencing more fallout, which is, as you know, it includes death, not just by overdose, but these shelter occupants die from unnecessary ailments. They're neglected in some cases. They're murdered, and that's my story. Is I represented a community where we begged for more security for ourselves and the shelter occupants. And 2 months later, somebody was brutally murdered in his unit. And we got no apologies and no statement whatsoever from our decision makers and our officials. And, it's just, that's another thing that divides the community, is the attitude about, like, and I don't know every single community how their relationships are, but generally we find the attitude is pretty arrogant and condescending toward our concerns. But we're including all citizens in our concerns for public safety. And how do you think that makes a surrounding community feel when one of the shelter occupants, not only do they die from overdose, and it's on display, we get to see all 7 responders come on board, but what about when they're violently murdered? Or what about the innocent bystander that was walking past the safe injection site in Leslieville, Toronto, and her life was ended? Her 2 young children don't have a mother. Her loving husband is now a widow. Like, where are all the rights and equality and justification for those situations? Because it's not just they're not just one-offs.
Right. Let's face it, when you put a whole bunch of people who are wasted out of their trees on drugs, there's going to be drug deals going down. There's going to be drug dealers in the area.
Yeah.
Like, let's call a spade, okay? That is a hub for using drugs.
Because of what migrates to it. You're right.
Yeah. We have all these low barrier shelters. When I would go to pick up my son, Ben, I'd sit across the street and I'd watch bicyclists come with a knapsack. You could predict it. You could teach it every day. And they just drop off and deliver all the drugs right in plain sight. The police could have got them at any time. Never did.
Yeah, it's perplexing. And I think you might be onto something when you suggested that it takes an entire system to allow all of these things to persist. There's some weak links there. And without an investigation and without without bringing it up to those who can truly do, a forensic on all of the connectedness with how this is allowed to happen, then it's going to persist, and that's a scary thought. And that's why I'm also part of my group, is to raise awareness and to get people to stand up and put a voice to it, and let their elected officials know how they feel. Because if we do nothing, we lose our freedom. We will lose our freedom. And some of my communities have already lost their freedom. Their children can't go out to recess without the teachers having to go outside and take a look-see and see what's happening in the immediate community, for fear of what the children are gonna walk out and see.
Yeah. Well, our Santa Claus parade got canceled this year, got postponed, excuse me, because there was a drug shootout, and it's happening more and more, like downtown. Like when it gets to the point where the whole city has to shut down because there's a couple of people on drugs, in having a shootout downtown. Like at some point, you got to stop. The public has to stop and say, "What the hell is happening to my?"
Well, I think there's a lot of finger pointing. There's a lot of blame shifting between levels of government and in council. I know that there's a lot of discord within councils themselves, because there's differing views. Some people are hinged on the human rights issues, and some people are emotional. Some people are more political. Whatever is driving the bus, I think it's time to give more focus and consideration to acknowledging the limitations of what's happening in the existing programs, and realizing that if that takes challenging some of these human rights messages, then maybe that's what it takes. Because yes, Canada has a human rights approach to housing, but if that's causing harm, then it's not adding any equality. In fact, it's not even a righteous society any longer. It's nefarious.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the human rights were never designed to kill people. The privacy law was never designed to kill people. Like that's where you have to draw the line. There has to be some kind of sense, basic common sense that says, if the application of this, which I think is highly manipulative, especially in the case of the privacy law, we can't allow you to talk to your kid. We can't allow you to know what's going on with your kid because of the privacy law, which then exacerbates them continuing to use drugs and not get help. And it leads to their death. Well, who's responsible for that? That was the privacy law. Wow. And all the people who adhered to the privacy law, they also have the blood of that person on their hands.
It's a tragic situation, but there's got to be some common sense and willingness to intervene when things don't sit right, and you have that gut feeling too. And I think we all have that point where in our guts we know this is wrong. And like, for instance, people have the human right to be housed, but once they're adequately housed, it doesn't give them the right to harm people in that community. And when that happens, that needs to be dealt with accordingly. Personally, I think a lot of this could be avoided if we could be more realistic about the limitations to some of these philosophies, housing first philosophy, let's call it. These olive community, person-centered approaches that meet them where they're at and leave them where they're at. I think based on what's happening now and the fallout, all things considered, with fentanyl being a big part of this equation, these types of shelters could be located in areas that are more or less harmful to the communities that surround them. Because nice idea, well-intentioned philosophy, having a person-centered approach, but this also now means having not just negative impact on the community, and not just inconveniencing the surrounding community, but actually harming the surrounding community. So once we're able to acknowledge that, then I think we could move forward. But I think we're stuck in a failure to acknowledge right now.
Yeah, because people don't want to admit that they made a mistake, which is our fatal demise right there. But we should be more like Portugal. If someone actually was using out in public and leaving needles there, and kids are finding them, they should get charged. They should have, at that point, they should have a juncture that says you have three choices. This is what they do in Portugal. You can go into recovery. Here's the path. You can go to jail, or you can get fined. And
I'm 100% behind that, because then you've given a person a choice.
Yeah. And more often than not, which is why they are doing so well, that person wants and chooses recovery.
Only but for the fact that our government is not really funding, or they're drastically underfunding recovery. And so part of what we're doing in my group is we're advocating to bring it back.
Yeah. Tell us about your two petitions, exactly and precisely what you're petitioning for.
Okay. So we have, they're both very similar. They might be a little bit differently worded, but so Cheryl Gallant has a petition on the floor where it's to say, basically, to shut down the drug use sites and to shut down drug use in our communities. And if that means taking the drug use out of the shelters, then that's what it means. And so it's got a community safety, very, very focused on community safety. So it's about fentanyl. It's about how overdose is harming our community and our children. And so we have that. It's a paper petition. It's a little bit more labor intensive, and it's a little bit more prescriptive. Has to be on legal size paper. It's only 25 signatures at a time, but that suits. I'm going to bring that to my vendor booth later this month. I'm going to bring that to a local festival where I have a vendor booth, and I'm going to have people be able to sign that one because it's paper. But Kevin Vuong, he's a member of parliament out of the Toronto, Spadina area. So his community is involved with us as well, and he endorsed a petition, and it's along the same lines, only it adds another alternative. It adds an alternative for what's called opioid antagonist therapy, the OAT treatments, and not everybody gets behind that, but it's really only an alternative. And I know in the legal world, you always, you make your demands, and then you say, in the alternative, you can do this. So it's not that we want any sort of enabling, as we call it, or as we feel about it. But if there was going to be an alternative, that's the one we would choose. But ultimately, we choose recovery. And so we're looking for recovery as a pathway out of addiction for people who are suffering, so that we are not all suffering. And that's really what it's about.
Yeah.
We feel really strongly about it. So we're going to be looking for a lot of, all of our communities are going to be encouraged to make contact with their politicians that are going to support and put these talking points on the floor.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we have 40,000 parents just like me in this country who've lost their kids now. And those parents,
it's unnecessary, and I'm so sorry.
Yeah, those parents would get behind that petition. So this is the call to all the parents, and that's just the ones who've lost their kids. Imagine about all the ones, and what kind of number there is out there of people who have addicted loved ones right now. Like, those are the people that we're calling to right now to stand up and voice what they have to say, what the solutions are. I mean, getting back to not admitting that you're or admitting that you're wrong. There's something in the human psyche, or the ego, if you will, that will not, admitting you're wrong to this one is a doozy. Because if you do admit, you're admitting to the death of all these people. So people are going to hang on to the fact that they're right about this all the way to, another 40,000 people dying.
For sure they are. And, some of these people are attached to it intrinsically. It's part of their identity. I know there's certain provinces in our country that are very much entrenched in a certain belief system, a way of living, a political view, let's call it. They get indoctrinated, or they get associated and affiliated with these.
Look how compassionate we are. Look how people-centered we are. Look how good we are. Look how.
It starts. I think I could be wrong, but I don't think I am. It's kind of part of the whole social justice regime, and that happens. It happens a lot when people go to school. After high school, they go to colleges, or they go to university, and they get in line with these side groups, and they go to these other sort of extracurricular interest groups, and they sort of get pulled into a way of belief, a belief system. Somebody told me that an example of that is the Ashoka universities. It's a kind of it's a sidebar of certain universities in Canada, and they get pulled into a lot of social justice warriorism.
Well,
it's not all bad. I'm not saying it's all bad, but what I'm trying to demonstrate is that some people are entrenched in this belief system to the degree that it would be like abandoning their own identity. It would be such a blow to their identity that they're hanging on for dear life. And yet, meanwhile, you and I and so many other people are experiencing the fallout. We're witnessing what's going on. We're affected in all different ways. And we're watching people die. We're watching people suffer in front of us. We're witnessing a subculture that we should never have to witness. And in so many different ways. Some people are dying, and other people are dying for the, these are all preventable deaths. I think that a lot of these deaths could be prevented if we just backpedaled on some of these policies.
Yeah, I agree. And going back to what I was saying about personal liberties, these, human rights that everyone is advocating for, under the auspices of being compassionate human beings and people-centered, but personal liberties truly without responsibility for the outcome and the impact of how those personal liberties impact other people in the world. Like, that is so corrupt and manipulative to turn it around and make it, it's a human right thing. But it doesn't matter if it kills 40,000 people. And it doesn't matter if hundreds of thousands of people are suffering from drug addiction. As long as you don't tell me what to do. This is the you don't tell me what to do society. As long as you don't tell me what to do, and I can have my opinion, and I can look good because I'm,
we're in a society right now where some people have more equality than others. Some vulnerable populations have more equality than other vulnerable populations. And what it relies on right now to change that is to push back on it and challenge it. And say, and you know what, anybody that wants to stand on their hill of righteousness and say, well, this person over here who is refusing to get help or is not being accommodated and is causing harm to the community, and if that person has more rights than the vulnerable children in that neighborhood or that society, we're not living in a righteous society. So let those people stand on their hill of righteousness and make that announcement, and then we'll see who they really are. And I think it falls in line with an unwillingness to acknowledge the limitations or the fallout.
Yeah.
How willing will they be to stand up and say, you know what, I am not prioritizing the rights of children now. I'm prioritizing these people over here. So I'd like to see who's going to stand on that hill.
I like when I think about solutions. If someone asked me what is the solution to this, I would say, here, take half the money that you put in low barrier shelters and create recovery programs. Just half of it. And with that half, that allows at least the people who do want to be in sober living accommodations the ability to actually recover and be by being in a sober place, at substance-free place. And then the other solution would be, okay, well, any drug like fentanyl, right, that has the side effect death is no longer allowed in our country. It's kind of simple, isn't it?
Well, that relies on so many things working properly. And we've already seen the fallout of programs that have no policy framework. And so, to manage your expectations, I would think that would take a huge overhaul and a lot of acknowledgement that the current system is failing.
Yeah.
And we're not there yet. But
because of bribes and because of corruption and because of people looking away and because Canada Post, you can get your drugs through Canada Post. Like, what the heck is going on? You just get on the internet, order them. Like, it's nuts.
I think some people might just say it's more obvious than that. I mean, you can speculate about corruption, and we can try to pinpoint where that might be, but it could just be as simple as many of our decision makers just want to be compliant. They're just going to go with what they're being told, and without blaming them, they may not know the devil in the details. They may not really realize it's do service managers really know that? Do they really know the devil in the details, or do they know and they're just not saying, yeah, we have a whole bunch of wraparound services, but they're entirely voluntary, and hardly anyone ever uses them. And we keep getting funding for these programs that nobody's using, but hey, they're there. And so, at least they're there. But really, do we have any evaluation metrics that tell us who's using these? And as far as taking some of that money and creating recovery programs, some people might say, but maybe these people don't want recovery programs. But then that might open up another can of worms of, if these people don't want recovery, should we just kind of let them terrorize the communities around them? Or is there a point or a threshold that we can create in our system, in our justice system, to say, at some point, you're going to be subject to an involuntary program?
Yeah.
It's not voluntary anymore.
I take 2-3 calls a day from people on death's door dealing with drug addiction. And those people are crying for addiction recovery.
They need on-demand recovery. It's not even just adequate to say we need healthcare and we need recovery programs. We need people to really figure out that people who are chronically addicted to drugs and in their lowest moments need to get into that recovery program within 2 hours.
Yeah, exactly. In Alberta, they do that. It's the 24/7 service.
Yeah.
As soon as you walk in the doors, you have a diagnosis right off the bat.
Yeah.
That's what's causing people to go in the right direction and to heal and get the medical help they need.
And we're spending an awful lot of money. And when I say awful lot, I'm being generous. But like, if people only knew how much money was getting taxed back to the taxpayer on maintaining all of these programs, and every year it's getting worse and worse. It's not getting better. You've got more and more programs. And
It's going to bankrupt our country.
Is this like, what is this? Is this perverse incentive? Are we creating problems so that we can get more money to create more problems to get more money? Because that's going to bankrupt every municipality. But is that intentional? That's speculation. I'm not going to say that that's intentional. It just happens to be happening.
Yeah. Brenda Rose says if it was their own people, in other words, they wouldn't feel so righteous. I think most decision makers just talk the talk, but that's it. They turn a blind eye and really don't know what's going on in the real world. They are ignorant, simple. Yeah. Those who are doing the real fight are those with loved ones who suffered the most.
Yeah, and there's a term for that. It's called luxury beliefs. That's what they call it. People who make decisions but live a privileged life are entitled to their luxury beliefs. But anyone who is truly touched by this dilemma is, from what I've seen, they're on the right side of it, which is to say recovery is where it's at.
Yeah. But
I know there's Todd Doherty. Todd Doherty is he's a member of parliament and he's on the health committee, and I know he has a backstory. I've seen him in a little clip there. Do you know who I'm talking about, Tina?
Yeah, I do. I've seen him.
So perfect example. You know, when your life is touched by this, you're never the same. And to think that one more day taking more drugs is the solution, then that person's going to have an epiphany. Well, you know what? Maybe there's some merit to that, but what if it takes, you know, I think a lot of people who are chronically addicted to these really potent drugs, they don't make it to that day because of the drugs. And that's why recovery is a better option.
Yeah, precisely. The drugs are so addictive and so powerful. You're not getting out. I mean, Ben's doctor, when Ben was on opioids, he said to me clearly that, like, there's no coming out of this, Tina. He's either going to jail, he's going to hospital, or he's going to die. And he died. And, you know, that's from someone who from the day he started smoking weed, he had no cause and effect, right from the early on. And he just did not have the capacity to make a decision in his own best interest, or he would have. So it's crazy, though. I don't know.
Definitely. And like, there's anybody who wants to stand in the way of the messaging of we need recovery programs is just they're gonna inherit a very bad look. It's, you know,
not only that, they're responsible for people dying.
We can't just not try.
Yes, exactly.
Right. So let's put it to the test and stop the nonsense. This is all a very one-sided approach to homelessness and addiction in tandem. And it's causing quite a lot of fallout. And so
and it's time for it to change. And your organization, Breakpoint, is doing so much to address that. So I want to thank you for that. And I can't believe we've been chatting for an hour, but it's time for us to wrap it up. Is there anything else you want to say before we go? Tell us what your website is, how people can sign your petition, all that good stuff.
Well, yeah, you can find us by searching Breakpoint Communities for Public Safety.
And it's breakpoint.ca, right? I think so.
Breakpoint Communities for Public Safety. Yeah, we're a .ca. Yeah. And there's a section on the website for action items, and the petitions are in the action items. Okay. And we will be adding more petitions during the following year. And we're going to be also adding a ton of little form letters that we can send out and pester all of our supporting politicians and hope that we can have a voice on the floor and in our local communities and in the House of Commons.
Good. Well, consider us, Guardians of Recovery, a sister organization of yours. I'm standing behind what you do every step of the way. And that goes to other organizations that are out there. I was speaking to a number of organizations earlier today. We are your sister organizations in recovery, all roads leading to recovery, reestablishing a culture of recovery, cities of recovery, towns of recovery. And I'm so happy to say that there are 30 cities popping up around the world right now that are inclusive recovery cities. So I look forward to seeing those cultures bloom and manifest into something creative and brand new. So thank you, Denise, so much for taking the time and for doing the work you do, because it's people like you that are going to change the world.
Ditto. I agree.
Yeah. So as we conclude, I encourage all of our listeners to ponder the importance of early prevention and education and shaping a safer future for our communities. And really think about what you can do, what petitions you can sign, where you can stand up and say your piece and stand for a better future for our kids, because it's up to every one of us. So thanks once again, Denise, for joining us. And to our listeners, thanks for tuning in to Guardians of Recovery. Remember, together that we all make a difference. Be well, be free, be drug-free. Over and out.
Absolutely. Bye.